It's time for the Douglas Coleman Show. Mr. Smooth and Savvy is joined by guests from all walks of life, from the entertainment industry to authors to political and social commentators, the famous and not so famous, the controversial and the light and fluffy. We have it all. Now, here's Douglas Coleman.
Okay, please welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show, Dr. Nicole Tetreault. Hello, doctor. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing fine, thank you. Thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it. So it looks like we're going to be talking about the mind today, and I got to just say this before we start. I had a guest on my video show last week who had a very interesting take where he said that the mind and the brain were two different things, that people often confuse them as being one. And he said that the brain is just the organ, like your heart or your lungs or your kidneys or your liver. And he said, but the mind is the byproduct or the data output from the brain. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I don't totally disagree. I mean, when you think about the brain being an organ, it's really a series of it's energy and atoms, right? And the mind kind of makes the process to allow for the energy and atoms to come into a state of knowledge and information, and being able to make decisions about that. Now, as an organ, the brain is very good at connecting to other brain regions and communicating about this through electrical impulses, which again is energy. And so, when we think about it sort of in a meditative practice, the mind really kind of separates itself out in the sense that it's kind of something higher order than just a reactionary organ responding to its environment.
Right. Well, there is perception involved, and he equated this. He was talking specifically about mental health, and he was talking about people that were diagnosed as schizophrenic and bipolar, what he said was that the organ is not functioning correctly, and so it's giving out inaccurate data. If you think of it like a computer printout, something is haywire in the computer, and it was giving out inaccurate data. And that's why people were responding to things that they thought they heard, the hearing voices, or thought that they saw, they were having hallucinations. And, it made sense to me. I guess there's different places one can go in the mind. And on your bio, you talked about meditation. And where does your book go with this, with the idea of the mind?
Yeah. So really, when I think about the mind, it's kind of what comes into our awareness. So, and I think of the mind in the sense of like the circle of awareness. So it begins first by when you're considering that there are thoughts. We have close to 60,000 thoughts a day. So that's a lot of thoughts.
Yeah.
And from that, the thinking mind, we have an emotional valence about all of these thoughts. And there's like 8 core emotions that, which now has been expanded to 28 emotions, coming all the way from joy to anger to sadness. And then there are the way that we perceive the information in our experience in that moment through our 5 senses. So sight, taste, touch, smell, hearing. And more recently, scientists at Caltech have found that people actually experience and have input and recognition in their brain to the electromagnetic field, which was only thought to be in bats and in different types of migratory insects like bees. And then from there, from all of that, it's really meant for us to have an action or a behavior. So I kind of think of it as this intertwined circle of awareness that as we're thinking about the brain perceiving the information, the awareness, which is kind of one step further from yourself. You could call it the mind, you could call it self-awareness or individual awareness, or oneness, the awareness of everything being interconnected. And when you think about that it's not just a simple, it's not just a simple process, because then you get into the fact, like, what happens to us beyond this lifetime, right? If we were just our organs, then there wouldn't be anything of an experience beyond this. And when you're thinking about mental health and mental challenges, when I talk about the circle of awareness, where things can fall apart are the stories and information and patterns that people have been conditioned to. And it could also be, on the other element, the perceiving of the environment gets disordered, right? Where, for example, we even have, let's not even take mental illness. Let's just take perception as something, as an experience. No two people are going to perceive their environment with the same awareness, because they have a different genetic component. They have different experiences that led to that moment, and at the same time, they have their own program conditioning. And then when you nail it down even further, for example, and you're talking about sense perception, there are people known as having a condition called synesthesia, where you have two sensory components co-activate as one. So, for example, people who have synesthesia, and there's about 80 different types, but one example would be where people see letters with color. And so every single letter in the alphabet is color, or words may be color, or days of the week are color. And that's like a different perception and experience. And it's basically in the brain, what's happening is you have two neural patterns that are co-activating due to a sensory experience that leads to a difference in their perception. That isn't a mental health issue that it leads to. It just leads to a very different perception. Just like you have people who, for example, could be colorblind, where they can't see in the range, they could be colorblind in the range of green and blue based on how their rods in their retina formed.
Or they could be...
So when you think of...
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, or they could be blind altogether.
Totally.
Yeah.
And somebody who's blind altogether is going to see and experience things very differently and have an awareness in their sensory experiences that are going to be of greater depth for probably olfaction and for sound. And so it's a very curious thing when we come back and we think about the mind and the plasticity behind it, and how really our current experience and the way that we wire our brain from moment to moment is very critical, and how our past and future kind of coalesce into the present moment.
Do we have any control over how our brain is wired?
I love that question. So when you're getting back into like my book, a huge component that I talk about is neurodiversity. And so, and when you're asking about how our brain's controlled or wired, is that we do know, for example, in people that are neurodiverse, that they are born with different brain wiring. And this different brain wiring can really create different perceptions, different ways of communication and production styles. And in that, a big part that I argue for is that really playing to the strengths of individual neural wiring that has to do with genetics and the way a person comes out. The second component is that our brains are plastic. So there are things we can do to build positive plasticity for our unique brain type. And so it's really important when you're thinking, it's that, nature and nurture component. We do know, for example, how meditation rewires the brain. And that's through just doing an 8-week practice. People's brains have, greater volume and expansion in a part of the brain called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And this part of the brain is very important for heart rate, blood pressure, temperature regulation, emotional saliency, understanding empathy, and connection with others, morality, and basically seeing others as part of yourself. And so a really important thing to consider is that through training our brain, and this happens in adults, which is great, an important thing is that we can always kind of, through different types of practices and trainings, train our brain. Now, when you're talking about certain conditions, if people are born with different types of brain wiring. So for me, for example, I'm dyslexic. Through training, I definitely know how to read. I can write. I'm a writer. And at the same time, my brain still sees black and white print very different than other people. So it's not like I learned how to develop my brain for my strengths and brought in the supports where I needed that. And at the same time, there are things for me that can still be challenging being dyslexic, where sometimes staring at black and white print can cause a visual aurora where I get a little dizzy, and I need to close my eyes. So there's a dance, right? There's a dance and a play with the mind where, you can work with what you have and build. And at the same time, there are each of us really, Glasser and colleagues showed in early, I think 2019, they did this fantastic magnetic resonance imaging where you image the brain in an MRI machine. And they used a really cool technique, parcellating out, through using software, of finding and identifying 80 new brain regions. And in that, they were able to detect each individual's brain in their software as an individual brain print. So they could identify the person with the brain just like you would do with a fingerprint. And so I think that's kind of a really enlightening element to consider. And even when I was studying in the laboratory, I would look at many brains under the microscope, and, they're all cataloged by numbers. And at the same time, they had distinctive qualities. They were each brain had its own type of patterning. Not to say that, of course, we all have a frontal cortex, we all have a occipital lobe and a cerebellum. We have these main structures, but in that, the way the tissue communicates and the patterns are unique to each individual.
Well, maybe that's what he was referring to, the difference between the brain and the mind. That,
yeah.
It's possible that the mind is actually the unique part that you were talking about, like the fingerprint, where the brain is just sort of the generic organ that we're all born with.
Yeah,
well,
we all have elbows, we all have knees,
right.
We all have a brain.
Right.
And the mind is really, what do you do with that information and energy?
That's sort of the byproduct of the brain. Yeah. Oh,
yeah.
Interesting. Okay. One of the things that I want to go back to, you had started to talk about perception. And the one that came to mind that's so common with people has to do with parent-child relations. And it's always interesting as an adult child when you deal with your mother or your father as an adult, and then someone else is in the room with you, like your best friend or something like that. Oftentimes they have a completely different perception of your parent than you do. And I always found that interesting because, I've introduced people in the past to my mother, and I would say, well, she's a little bit like this or blah, 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 or whatever. And then when they would meet her and after we'd leave, they say, wow, she's nothing like that. It's happened to me over and over and over again. And I always find that interesting because we have this particular perception of our parents that it seems like only the children would have that perception. And even with siblings, it can be different. If a brother and a sister with the same mother, the sister may view or perceive the mother differently than the boy. It's not always, but it oftentimes. Now, why is that, do you suppose?
Well, I mean, the perception comes to interpersonal relations, right? And your personal history with the individual. So it goes back when we're thinking about the circle of awareness that we were talking about earlier. And the circle of awareness is really loaded with your autobiographical memories. And so your autobiographical memories and the stories you tell yourself about your relationship with your mother and your perception of how you see your mother or the things that your mother may say, you know, you have an expectation for her to be fulfilling in that space, right? Where your friend, for example, has no prior history, has no personal stories behind that, except for the exact moment that you're in with them. And so in that exact moment, your mother's free from the history of the stories, and your friend is experiencing your mother in the current state that she actually is, rather than with the history of information that would feed into the experience.
Okay, so it's a lot of baggage, basically, where the friend doesn't have all that baggage. Yeah, okay.
You could call it baggage, sure.
Well, it makes sense because, you know, let's face it, as we get older, we get a little bit more set in our ways. And if you have a parent and a child who are like-minded, even though the perceptions
Totally.
could be completely different, you know, it's always going to be that conflict. And I think it stays there forever. And I think that the only way to reconcile that is to just accept the fact that, you know, yes, we're going to disagree on this and that, but beyond that, you know, there is a certain commitment that needs to be made to love each other. And I think that's the only way it ever works. It's kind of like a long-term marriage. You know, once the honeymoon wears off, then marriage really becomes about commitment. And love is sort of intertwined with the commitment. You say, well, I'm going to stay with this person, even though we've had arguments and fights and I don't like this about them or whatever, and they don't like this about me. You make the commitment to stay because there is that feeling of love. It doesn't always work out that way. Some people bail on the relationships, and, you know, maybe it wasn't meant to be, but I think we're getting off topic here a little bit. Let me bring this back to your book, and then we got to kind of...
No, I think love is a fantastic area. I mean,
okay.
I really appreciate what you're talking about. You know, when we think about it and you think about love, you know, love in our Western culture is always something that you experience as cultivating outside of yourself, where in reality, when it comes to perception, like all we are is really love. And to think about, for example, a mother, you know, regardless if a mother is challenging, you know, that mother did come out with the devotion to give birth, to be there, and all the imperfections, I think the child-mother relationship, the partner-partner relationship, and even relationships with people that, you know, aren't so intense or so close. You know, Ram Dass always talks about, you know, you could go do all this work and come back and see your family and you'll really know how enlightened you are. Because the bottom line is our families have created they've, you know, the buttons we're built on, they've created those buttons, so they know how to push them.
Right.
And when you think about, you know, love in itself, it's really just accepting the person for who they are without an expectation. I think where we get so lost in it is that the expectation that somebody else needs to fulfill something to create a feeling. And when you're thinking about loving awareness and being in presence with an individual, it's loving them exactly where they're at, with a crabby attitude, maybe with a rough remark, you know, maybe with, you know, compassion. You know, maybe they're showing you compassion, and that seems like a very easy moment to share that love with them. And at the same time, I think that's the work that we do is to I feel like we're brought into this world with all these different people to be our teachers, whether they're our family or friends or a stranger on the street. They're all teaching us something of how to tap into a greater awareness and acceptance for people to be exactly who they are in their essence. Not to condone bad behavior, or allow people to walk all over you or harm you. And at the same token, allow them to be who they are as an individual.
Well, it's a difficult thing for people to do sometimes because they get, I suppose, very self-centered and thinking, well, I know what's best. And when you have to compromise with that person on something that you disagree with, it becomes the real challenge. But it also becomes an enlightening moment where you think, okay, this is what it's about. This is what commitment really means, is even though I disagree, I'm going to go along with it because I love this person and I need to appease them. Otherwise, the fight will be unwinnable. There is an enlightenment to that. I learned it the hard way. I learned it twice, once with my mother and once with my wife. So it kind of, it really, hit home for me because I was running into the same thing. Different experiences, but the same kind of affront, if you will. And they always say men marry women just like their mothers. And it's funny how that came to be because there was this challenge with me where I would look at my wife and go, you know what, my mother would have said the exact same thing. And but it's all warm and fuzzy at this point. This was years ago. We've gotten over all of that.
Yeah, manifesting the mother. I think there's also just ways in which people communicate and we get used to different types of patterns. So at the same time, we could also be looking for them based on our conditioning rather than them actually being, it's sort of when we go back to the perceptions and mind, if we perceive that our partner is going to be similar to our parental figure, then over and over we're going to be culling our awareness into that, like, oh, I did marry a person that is, just like my parent.
Right. And, it's funny how oftentimes the in-laws don't always get along, because I think they're kind of on the same path. It's opposites tend to do better with each other. Not always, but you find that if you marry somebody that's like you, there seems to be more conflict than if you marry somebody who's completely different. I've seen that over and over again. My parents were a perfect example. My mother and father were total opposites, and they got along fine. And my father always said, oh, you're just too much like your mother. That's why you butt heads all the time. I said, oh, okay, I accept that. Let me bring this back to your book, and then we got to kind of wind this down. So your book is called Insight into a Bright Mind. Is this a self-help type book, or what's the takeaway? What can the reader expect if they pick up the book and start reading?
Yeah, so the book really, it was born out of a real care to offer the understanding of what neurodiversity means. And I really go through and identify the different types of brain. And when we talk about neurodiversity, it's found in 1 in 5 people, includes people with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dysgraphia, people with anxiety, depression, and it kind of goes through what the brain looks like and how to really strengthen the positives in these different brain types. Like giving an example, people who are ADHD are highly creative and can hold a lot of different ideas in their mind. And so kind of giving parents the awareness of, and educators and clinicians and people who are neurodiverse themselves to really compassionately understand how their different brain wiring is a superpower. And in that superpower, you can really kind of build that brain towards its natural strengths and have a fulfilled life. That's kind of the goal of the book, and to kind of bring neurodiversity to the forefront where it's not, where people aren't otherized, where it's really kind of open and accepted in society, and instead of looking at it from a disability, look at a strength and ability perspective.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I think we've focused too much when we use the term diversity. We've focused too much on the physical outward diversity, skin color, race, religious beliefs, political beliefs, and we have spent little time on neurodiverse people, where you're either sort of quote-unquote normal or not. And I think that's wrong. I think that's a wrong perception, because I know several people who are dyslexic and autistic who are incredibly creative, incredible painters, writers. One is a fantastic poet. They're just an amazing poet. And it's because they see things in a different way, so they create something that hasn't been created yet, hasn't been thought of, because their unique brain fingerprint, as you said, or mind fingerprint, sees this particular thing in a different light, and they're able to put it down for other people to see, and other people look at it and go, oh, wow, yeah, okay. So it is true. Well, we'll get there. I don't know. The human race is slow to evolve, isn't it?
Yeah, we're doing our best.
We're doing our best. We got a long way to go, but we're getting there a little bit at a time. Nicole, we do have to wind this down. We are out of time. Thank you so much for coming on. Do you have a website that you want to give out, one for the book or a personal website?
Yeah, sure. People could find me at NicoleTetreault.com is my website. I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Awesome Neuro. So, yeah, definitely check out the book. I have a lot of articles on my website that kind of get into mental health and neurodiversity and meditation. So thanks for having me. Great. And wishing you all the best.
Well, it was a pleasure talking to you. It was nice meeting you. And best of luck with the book. The book is out now and available?
It is. It's out everywhere books are sold.
Okay, super. Well, thanks again for coming on the show. Best of luck.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.